Okay. Good evening and welcome. Thank you for being with us tonight. My name is Laura Brower-Haygood, and I am the Executive Director of the DC History Center. We are just so pleased to present tonight's book talk featuring editors and contributors to Facing Georgetown's History, a reader on slavery, memory, and reconciliation. So for those of you who are not familiar with us already, allow me to just say a few words of introduction. The DC History Center is a nonprofit educational and research organization founded in 1894. Our mission is to deepen understanding of our city's past, to connect, empower, and inspire. And we do this work through research and scholarship, youth education, adult programs like this one, and exhibits. We're located in the historic Carnegie Library at Mount Vernon Square, and our exhibits are now open to the public on Friday and Saturday afternoons. You'll find us online at dchistory.org and on social, but of course, we're really hopeful that you'll come visit us. I'm sure many of you here tonight remember the 2016 New York Times article that brought national attention to the history of slavery at Georgetown University and highlighted the institution's efforts to acknowledge and make amends with its past. So tonight, we present a conversation with editors and contributors to Facing Georgetown's History, a newly released collection of essays, articles, and documents that further illuminate Georgetown's tangled history with slavery. The personal stories within this institutional history serve as a microcosm of the legacy of slavery from the school's origins up until now. In short, tonight's conversation is a case study in how institutions and communities are called to reckon with a dark legacy of violent colonization and ruthless exploitation. So let us begin by acknowledging that we stand on the ancestral lands of the Necochunk or Anacostan people and the Piscataway people. We recognize over a dozen tribal nations living across the region, along the Anacostia and Potomac watersheds, the Chesapeake Bay area, and on the land today considered part of Virginia and Maryland. And here in the District of Columbia, enslaved people participated in the building of our city, our streets, and our structures. We honor their hard labor, as well as the many contributions that shaped our nation as we know it today. As we learn about the individuals Georgetown University enslaved, we pay tribute to them and recognize their dignity and sacrifice. So our program tonight will be moderated by Bell Julian Clement, the editor of Washington History, the DC History Center's signature magazine. If topics like tonight's interest you, I encourage you to become a member of the DC History Center, since our members receive 2 issues of Washington History each year. And for those of you who are already members, the most recent issue, which looks like this, should already be in your hands. And so I take this moment to congratulate Bell and managing editor Jane F. Levy for a superb issue of the magazine. Bell Julian Clement is a historian interested in federal urban and community development policy, particularly as it has unfolded in Washington, D.C. and its region. She has participated in D.C. urban development efforts as a community organizer, working with grassroots neighborhood associations, as an economic development planner in D.C.'s Department of Housing and Community Development, and as an advocate for small minority business with the D.C. Chamber of Commerce. Her public history engagements include service as interim director of the Historical Society of Washington, D.C., the DC History Center, during 2006 and 2007, and the development of public programming for the Washington, D.C. Humanities Council. She holds BA, JD, and MBA degrees from the University of Chicago and a doctorate in history from Georgetown University, where she teaches American history. We are honored to have her on our team as editor of Washington History. And now I'd like to invite Bell to join me on the screen.
Laura, thank you for the context, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. In turn, it is my privilege and pleasure to introduce the team for tonight. Let me first say welcome to all of you joining us. We appreciate your decision to share some of your precious time with us this evening for this most fascinating work, for discussion of this most fascinating work. A couple of instructions, which I guess everyone is familiar with, but just in case, please do, let me again urge people to use the Q&A. Much of the real treasure of these discussions tends to come out of Q&A, and we want very much to hear from you. Do put your questions into Q&A, not into chat. but watch chat, because our mavens here at the DC History Center, Maggie and Maren, will be loading chat with, possibly loading chat with important references to you, and will importantly be making sure that you know how to get your own copy of Facing Georgetown's History. With that, let me ask, could we be joined by our scholars? And I will launch with introductions, which are abbreviated because this is a very long list of credentials and scholarly accomplishments here. Let me start with Adam Rothman. Professor Rothman is professor in the history department at Georgetown, where he serves on the Georgetown Working Group on Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation. He is currently the principal curator of the Georgetown Slavery Archive. Professor Rothman has written extensively on slavery and on the Chesapeake. His most recent works include Beyond Freedom's Reach, A Kidnapping in the Twilight of Slavery, published by Harvard University Press in 2015 and an award winner, and also Slave Country, American Expansion and the Origins of the Deep South, something I'm anxious to get my hands on, published also by Harvard in 2005. Dr. Elsa Mendoza is assistant curator of the Georgetown Slavery Archive. Her dissertation, Catholic Slaveholders, Enslaved People, and the Making of Georgetown University, 1792 to 1862, figures, of course, directly in the work that we are examining tonight. One of her essays is included in this book, and to me was a revelation, but we'll get to that. Lauret Savoy is a photographer, a pilot, and the David B. Truman Professor of Environmental Studies and Geology at Mount Holyoke College. Professor Savoy's books include Trace, Memory, History, Race, and the American Landscape, 2016 publication. She is also co-editor of a work entitled The Colors of Nature, Culture, Identity, and the Natural World, published in 2011. Both these books are award winners. So right there, you've got your reading list. Now, let's plunge in here and think a little bit about this remarkable work. Laura has nicely given us the context and the basic scope of Facing Georgetown's History. The work is in effect a toolbox for those of us who are interested in taking apart the entanglement between this university and the slave economies that characterized our regions and in some respects still characterize our region. We're going to discuss a number of different aspects of this work tonight. We will by no means get fully plumb everything that is in this capacious work, but we will think a little bit about the source of this project, a little bit about its context within the local Jesuit community, the way that community shaped the university, and its connection with the neighborhood of Georgetown in the city of Washington. And then importantly, the circumstances of what is probably the culminating event in this narrative as it is structured here, which is the 1838 sale of 272 enslaved people from plantations in Maryland, owned and operated by Jesuits, into Louisiana. Professor Rothman, if I could start with you. This book is a fascination because it's not the usual scholarly book. It has, it seems to me, a unique connection to our immediate present, to your life there at Georgetown University. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you came to the project, and also fill us in a bit on the background of how the project came to be.
Sure, Belle. Thank you so much for that introduction, Laura, as well. You may have heard my dog barking in the background, one of the hazards of Zoom. but she has a lot to say about the subject too. I want to actually start with Juneteenth, because there's a connection between this new national holiday and Georgetown's history of slavery, and particularly the 1838 sale that you mentioned, Bell. So I'm sure everybody who's tuning in here is now aware of the significance of the holiday of Juneteenth, which commemorates the announcement of emancipation in Galveston, Texas, by General Gordon Granger of the United States Army on June 19th, 1865. So for the nation now, June 19th signifies, at least it symbolizes, the end of slavery. But that date, June 19th, actually has another signification in our own history, in Georgetown's history that we're talking about today. Because oddly enough, June 19th, 1838 is also the date when Reverend Thomas Malady, the head of the Maryland Jesuits, sold the Maryland Jesuit enslaved community to Henry Johnson and Jesse Beatty, two planters in Louisiana. So June 19th, the date of Juneteenth, has these layers of meaning for us. It's really a bittersweet anniversary. And I think that highlights something very important about this volume and this history and the way we think about it. And that's the idea that this is our history. This is our local history, the history of our own backyard, our institution, our city, and our place in this country. So I couldn't avoid mentioning that odd coincidence of the date of Juneteenth. In terms of the origins of the book, I had the good fortune to be a member of Georgetown's working group on slavery, memory, and reconciliation in 2015, 2016. That was a group of Georgetown faculty, students, staff, and alumni that was charged by President Jack DeJoy of the university with looking into Georgetown's history of slaveholding and making a series of recommendations to the university community about how we could face that history. I'm a historian of slavery. That's my specialty. I knew something about this history and had even taught it in my classes before 2015, but I had never made it central. And the thing that really stood out to me as a member of the working group was the idea that the history was known to scholars. It was known to some folks around Georgetown who had written about it and studied it. It was even part of the American Studies curriculum at Georgetown for a time. But the thing that was really striking to me was that when the working group was formed and this history began to become more known to the university community, it came as a real shock to almost everybody at Georgetown, and certainly people outside the university. And I felt like it was a real failure of myself and my colleagues in the historical profession in telling the story. So I think one of the obligations that we took out of that experience was that we had to find ways not just to continue the research into Georgetown's history of slavery, which is a fascinating and important history, but we had to find ways to tell the story over and over to new audiences so that people would know what happened. So we took some steps in that direction at Georgetown. I've been teaching a class called Facing Georgetown's History for the last 5 years. And in many ways, this book emerges out of that class and the collaborations that I've enjoyed in teaching this history at Georgetown, collaborations with people like Elsa, who's written a dissertation on the subject, people like Professor Savoy, who have their own connections to this subject. So Facing Georgetown's History arises out of our effort at Georgetown to not just learn about this history, but to spread the word.
So this is a project that weaves this into the fabric of known history in a new and more effective way. Dr. Mendoza, so you're there deep, elbow deep. I'm picturing you in the archives. Can you say a little bit? You of course had a world to choose from. You chose this project and you spun it into deeper research. How did all that happen?
Yes, you're right. It was like a deep, deep dive in the archives. I started working on this in 2017 as, a graduate student in the summers because I had no money. So I became a research assistant. And I was struck by the amount of documentary evidence that one can find about the presence of enslaved people at Georgetown's campus, for example, and the documentary evidence of the lives of enslaved people in the Maryland Jesuit plantations. So to me, it seemed that there was this whole universe, and as Adam has mentioned, people didn't know about it, but the documents were there. And that was one of the reasons why I decided to research this further. One of the reasons was actually one particular document. It was a letter that I mentioned in the epilogue. And it mentioned the case of a woman. This letter is not written by an enslaved woman, but by a priest. And this priest recalls that he questioned a woman that was enslaved in a plantation called St. Inigos. The woman was named Suki. And in her old age, she recalled how she had been whipped by a priest. And that she thought that she had been whipped because of her curiosity. The document is now at the Georgetown Slavery Archive. I became very emotional when I read this document. And then I was also struck by the fact that one could not find references of the document in stories about the history of slavery in the Jesuit plantations. So to me, that was one of the reasons why I decided to grapple with this history further. To me, it seemed kind of like a moral obligation now that I was there to grapple with this history further, because we cannot just leave these documents to lie in the archive without using them and without bringing them to others, which is also why the Georgetown Slavery Archive exists. And one of the reasons why the Slavery Archive exists as well, which is a website, so is that all of us that are interested in this history can look at these documents from their screens, from their home, without having to go to the archive. So that is how I ended up embedded in all of this. It was actually, kind of like an accident. It was my lack of money during the summers that made me become a research assistant. If not, I would be studying something completely different.
It sounds to me like it was your curiosity.
Yes, I do agree, because that document itself, actually, if you went to the finding aid, when you go to an archive, there's usually a finding aid because someone has already written a guide for you to look at these documents. And I remember, and I'm still struck by this letter that mentions Suki's experience is cataloged as a letter about plantation affairs. That's it. So it doesn't mention her.
So I'm guessing that Maggie or Maren have already put up the link to the Georgetown archives so that our participants tonight can begin accessing. I hope we'll get back to that, but let's put that out there, as you say, that these documents are accessible to all who are interested, your entire readership. Professor Savoy, you have a curious, to use that word again, and fascinating series of links to this project. It seems to me that you are linked directly, not only in your scholarship, but you also have an intimate personal relation, and you also have a serendipitous relationship. Can you tell us anything about any of that?
Well, first of all, thank you, Bell. And I want to thank the DC History Center and Laura Brower-Haygood and everyone who's bringing this event. And of course, my deep thanks to Adam and Elsa for inviting me to join them in writing the foreword to the book, but also joining them here this evening. This is truly a gift. There are different ways to answer your question, Bell. And first of all, if you don't mind calling me by my first name, whenever I hear Professor Savoy, I often think,
you have to grade something?
Yes, or I'm in trouble. So please call me Lauret. I really would be grateful for that. My interests, you could say my passion is really in how this nation's still unfolding history has marked the land, as well as people, as well as individuals. And in the case of myself, has marked me and my family. And so one of the key questions that I think is important for many people to consider is what is our, or what is your, or what is my personal relationship with history on this land, the history that's told and the history that's hidden. And in trying to answer that, as far as my family, my paternal family, I learned that my father's ancestors lived in the Chesapeake region since at least early colonial days, if not longer. And these are people of African descent, European descent, but also indigenous descent. But I knew nothing about them because I grew up in a family that was silent about its past. And so in beginning to try to search for clues, I met Adam, then Elsa. I also met other people like Will Thomas. And the serendipity is that the first time I met Adam was at Georgetown University, trying to look at the archives, the Jesuit archives, to try to see if there was a trace of enslaved ancestors on Jesuit property. And I was told by one of the reference staff there that I would have to share the materials with another patron, and that other patron was Adam, who was pulling them that day to show to descendants of a family that had been enslaved, the Queen family. It turns out I have Queen ancestors as well. And so on that day, I met Adam and met family many generations removed from a common ancestor. Yes, it was serendipity, it was a gift, it was many different things. And with their help, they've helped me dig more deeply into that journey of trying to uncover a past that, in many cases, for people who are descended from those who have been enslaved, a past that is silent, erased, eroded, completely weathered away. But in this case, there are traces, and that's what I'm trying to find. So I think that's a short response.
To a very lengthy and in-depth subject. And of course, the Queen family is a famous and important family here in this history. We have a cite to a recent book by your colleague, William Thomas, called A Question of Freedom, and dealing with the struggle of the Queen family and
Right.
other families here in Prince George's. Thank you. Using the courts, using Anglo-American law to free themselves. So you see, we have this embarrassment of riches here in this lineup. As to the book itself, focus and structure, this examination of slavery at Georgetown and in the district and in the Chesapeake region and in the United States of America. As Laura Haygood very usefully pointed out, this volume is almost a toolkit, a workbook for those of us who are interested in understanding the intricacies of this and understanding the way the system fit together. And the structure of the book reflects that. It's a mix of essays, documents, and current journalism. Two major parts. The first part, titled History, itself has two subsections, including contextualizing essays and original primary sources, original documents that help us place individual human beings in context around this controversy of slavery. Second part, which is denominated Memory and Reconciliation, has four subsections. Again, a collection of essays, including the landmark essay published by Ta-Nehisi Coates in 2014 in Atlantic on the question of reparations. Other subsections include journalism on or about members of the working group on slavery at Georgetown, earlier mentioned. Also contributions from descendants of the 272 persons who were displaced from Maryland by the sale in 1838. And then finally, a section titled Reconciliation and Reparation, which has a number of contributions which consider this question of how the university and its community will move forward from here. Let's look at the background of the events, the very complicated environment that using these tools, this volume helps us as students of this begin to unwind it. And so I guess a question to the panel might be, in general, what might readers be helped by knowing about the Jesuit order? What might it be helpful for readers not otherwise familiar to know about who Jesuits were, what the mission was, how they operated, their scope?
Elsa, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Well, the first thing that I think it's important, especially for the context of this book, is that the Jesuit order were known enslavers all across the world. Georgetown's history is not exceptional in that case. The Jesuits who founded Georgetown were just as many Jesuits who enslaved people in Brazil, in New Spain, in Africa. They enslaved people all across the world. It was part of their business model because as a Catholic order, they had to produce funds to sustain their evangelizing mission. So that is one of the things that distinguishes the Jesuit order. Another thing that's important to know, especially because it relates to the origins of Georgetown University, is that there is a point in time where the Jesuits are suppressed. They disappear from the world. The Pope decides that they are not going to be around anymore because they have grown too powerful. And these former Jesuits are the only Catholic priests in what became the United States, and they are the founders of Georgetown University. And as you can see, as I've mentioned, this is an order that was supposed to be self-sufficient, produce funds. They become involved in other places, in mining, in enslaving people to produce mines, everything, every economic activity that you can imagine, they become involved all across the world. And in the case of Maryland, they established plantations. And I'm pretty sure we have actually a map so that you can see the different Maryland stations. The Jesuits had multiple plantations all across Maryland. Now on the screen, you can see a map of the different Jesuit stations. These plantations were related to Georgetown University, and that's very important. They become a source to fund the university. The plantations that you see here on the map include places in Southern Maryland, just as St. Inigo's, which is in St. Mary's County. Then you have over there on the top, Bohemia, which was one of the oldest plantations and was related to the Archdiocese of Baltimore. There's also St. Thomas Manor. All of these plantations eventually are plantations from where people are sold in 1838. So that is also something important to know, that all of these plantations are going to be related economically to Georgetown University because they are producing crops that sometimes are sent to the college, and also because once these crops are sold, funds from the plantations are sent to the university. So those are important features to know about the Jesuit order. And I don't know if Adam, if you want to add anything else about the Jesuits, I will stop now because then I will speak for hours about them.
Well, that's very helpful. And Elsa, if I may, I will follow Lauret Savoy's guidance and switch to an informal mode here. So what we're looking at here is a worldwide operation.
Yes.
Elsa, you're telling us this is global. We know that the Jesuits start arriving on the East Coast of the United States even in the 16th century. They're concentrated initially up in New England, but by the middle of the 17th century, they are very active, as you have just shown us on this wonderful map, right next door to us here in Maryland. We know that these are the soldiers of God.
Yes, that's what they're called, the soldiers of God, because their founder was a soldier, Ignatius of Loyola.
And special mission, they seem to have a particular interest in education, various forms of education, which might have play in somehow to the founding of the university. You mentioned the 1773 suppression of the order, which I understand came about, just as you say, more because of not so much on a doctrinal dispute, which is familiar in some instances, but rather because, as you say, the order had become too powerful and just were messing in national business, particularly in France, in Europe, and people wanted them out. Spain wanted them out.
Yes, Spain wanted them out. So that's why they are expelled from all these territories. And in the case of the United States, what became the United States, they're not expelled. They remain here, independent. They create a corporation, and that corporation eventually is going to become the founder of Georgetown College.
Can you just wrap that up by telling us, how should I understand the governance relationship between the university and the plantations? Are they all run by the same committee, or what is the structure?
Yes. The college and these plantations are both the property of an entity called the Corporation of Roman Catholic Clergymen. This corporation was established by the Jesuits to put together all of their assets, meaning their land and the people that they enslaved. They decided to create this corporation because they feared that in some way, either a government or the Catholic Church was going to take away their property, as this property had been taken away in other parts of the world. So they found this corporation to preserve their property. They mentioned in their founding documents that their intention is to preserve the property in case the Jesuit order is restored, and that then all of this property would return to the Jesuits.
So we should understand this. The decisions that are made about plantation holdings are made by the same process and the same person as decisions.
Yes, exactly. And sometimes I would say even in the same places at the same time. One of a document that you can find in the Georgetown Slavery Archive, and that I've always found very striking, is that in a meeting, in a plantation that is on this map meeting at St. Thomas Manor, a group of priests who weren't Jesuits of the Corporation of Roman Catholic Clergymen, they met. I imagine them on a table discussing. And one of the things that they discussed was the foundation of a college to instruct young men. That was Georgetown College. And after that, the next point on the meeting was the disposal of what they called supernumerary slaves. They meant people that they thought were a burden for the plantation. In the same meeting, I think that, like, the minutes that we have of that meeting is one of the most evidence that we have of how they are connected. In the same meeting, they are deciding things that have to do with plantations as well as their college. So they are completely linked.
Right. So there's a very deep story there, which perhaps we can further get into in the Q&A. Another thing which I hope our Q&A'ers will lead us into, and Elsa, I know you have in particular a great deal to say about, is the situation on the university campus itself. But let's move for a moment. Let's circle around that and hope to get back to it, and talk a little bit about what I, as one of your readers, think of as the focal event of this work, which is the sale in 1838. And again, I wonder, one thing that might be useful for people to hear all of you explore is a little bit about what in the world is the Jesuit understanding of what slavery is. How is it that a Christian order is apparently, and for decades, and as has just been pointed out, around the world, completely comfortable with property in human beings?
Do you want to take that, Adam? You're the historian of slavery.
Sure. You are too, Elsa.
That's true, but
right. So I would say, one of the significant things about Georgetown's history of slavery and its ties to the Maryland Jesuits are that it's really a microcosm of the whole history of American slavery, from the rise of the plantation system in the Chesapeake in the 17th and 18th centuries to the contradiction between liberty and slavery in the founding of the new United States, to the emergence of a domestic slave trade in the 19th century, with tens of thousands of people being sold down the river, to the long and tangled history of emancipation. All of that is contained in a way in the history of our own backyard in its particular way. And I would add to that one of the remarkable things about this story are the records. The Maryland Jesuits kept extensive records. We have dozens and dozens of boxes of records from the Maryland Jesuits, some of it anyway, about the enslaved community that they owned and eventually sold. And it's just an extraordinary window into this history, an unparalleled window into this history. In those documents, if you read them closely, you can find information about enslaved individuals, their families, and their fates, and you can know them by name. And all of that is extremely important. It helps us, for instance, to understand precisely the question that you asked about. How is it possible for a society of priests to reconcile themselves to the sordid business of slavery? Well, this is the whole question of the accommodation of slavery and Christianity in the early modern world. A lot of people dealt with this question, but the Jesuits dealt with it in a very intensive way and left a lot of records behind that tell us how they were thinking about this. And the basic rationale that they arrived at, and they arrived at it through a process of discourse and thought, it wasn't unthinking at all, was that slavery was a Christianizing institution, and that slavery was justified because it brought all of these heathen, non-Christian people into the world of Christianity. And the harm that was done to their bodies was nothing in the Jesuit view compared to the good that was done to their souls.
Lauret,
that's the rationale. And if I could say one more thing, that rationale did impose certain religious obligations on the Jesuits as slave owners to be stewards of the souls of the people that they own. So you do find the names of enslaved people in the baptismal records, in the marriage records, and the burial records that were kept by the Jesuits. They regarded them as people with souls at the same time as they owned them. And one of the remarkable things is that you can find, and there are documents to this effect in the volume, you can find baptismal records for people who are then, sold, the next day, as it were. And if you can understand how the Jesuits could baptize their slaves one day and sell them the next, then you have a pretty good understanding of how American slavery worked.
and of course, the benefit to history is this treasure trove for historians.
Right.
A small money.
And not just historians, for people who are researching their family histories, for instance.
Lauret?
I was just going to say that there's an example that I include in the foreword of guidance given by the Reverend Father George Hunter, the superior, in 1749. And these are his words to supplement what Adam has just said. They were written in his spiritual retreat, and these are his words. To the greater glory of God, charity to Negroes is due from all, particularly their masters. As Negroes are members of Jesus Christ, redeemed by his precious blood, they are to be dealt with in a charitable, Christian, paternal manner, which is at the same time a great means to bring them to do their duty to God, and therefore to gain their souls. And so as Adam noted, and as Elsa has noted too, the records there are of the enslaved doing their duty to God in many different ways. And it's for, in my case, an earth historian who is also a descendant, trying to wade through or navigate that, that pathway to understand what I am seeing in documents and how it relates to ancestors. It's a very difficult thing. There was another piece of information that we have that goes back to one of the reasons why the Jesuits had so much property or land in Maryland, as well as enslaved working under them. And that is a page from the daybook of James Carroll, who was a very wealthy Catholic planter. And I'm wondering if we could pull that up. Thank you. And I want to ask Elsa and Adam to please speak about this page because it's very important in many ways. I'll just say that this account, if you can see at the top, it's dated September 1715, and it's a page from James Carroll's daybook. And it's a record, his daybook was a record of events and experiences, as well as an account of his commercial transactions, including sales and purchases. And it ranged from 1714 to about 1721. This page, his account of my Negroes, it's not everything that he is listing all in 1715, but you can see that he returned to that page multiple times over the years. You see names crossed out as people die. You see children's names crossed out as infants die. And one of my ancestors is listed on this page. Mary bought up Phillips and Larkin. And so to find that as documentary evidence is one thing, but to see inked in on a page someone about whom I would have known effectively nothing if not for this document and not for other records, including the freedom petitions that Wolfe Thomas has written about in A Question of Freedom. It's in some ways finding a distorted record, but still a record that otherwise I would not have had access to. Carroll died in 1729. He was unmarried. He left no children or had no children. And so he did provide for other family. He provided for the poor in the neighborhood. He even provided for some of the enslaved men in the range of granting them some clothes and making sure that their education was key. But he gave much of his estate in terms of land and human property to the Jesuits. And that is something that I don't think enough people realize as well. And these are estates in Anne Arundel County as well as Prince George's County.
Let me throw in one other consideration, again, on the subject of the Jesuit thinking on this, the rationale that enabled these transactions. This is from a statement from Father Ryder made in a public gathering in Richmond, Virginia in 1835. And for those of you who are keeping track, that puts this statement, which is a criticism from Father Ryder of the abolitionist movement, which is already gaining strength. Ryder is speaking 70 miles north and 4 years after the Nat Turner Rebellion, which resulted in the death by butchery, really, of at least 55 people, white people, men, women, children, toddlers. So he is, I point that out to say Ryder is speaking in a heated environment. And here's what he says, which I find deeply curious. Resolved that while we, I'm assuming the order, view slavery in the abstract as an evil, we hold it to be our first duty as Christians and citizens to support the civil institutions of our country. Adam, Elsa, help?
Yeah. That oration by Ryder is very striking. I believe we include it in the book. He says something there that just it haunts me. He says, our God is a God of order. Our God is a God of order, and that's part of his attack on the abolitionists as anarchists, basically. But I think one of the points to make there is that in addition to being a site of slave labor, Georgetown's campus, in addition to being a place where the Catholic slaveholding gentry educated itself and reinforced its class privileges, Georgetown and the other schools and colleges across the United States that that participated in these kinds of justifications of slavery were really part of the establishment of a pro-slavery normative order. So the university or the college, I would say, on a number of levels illustrates how the slave economy, how a slave society worked and was legitimated over time, even though, as we know, that legitimation ultimately crumbles and slavery is overthrown. But one other point about Ryder is that he is basically the faculty mentor of the Philodemic Society on Georgetown's campus, a debating society that's still around today. The students themselves have done some really interesting research on the history of the society. They've gone back into the minutes of the Philodemic and found debates about slavery, debates where the students oppose abolition. And the thing I want to highlight there is that throughout the last 5 years and even before at Georgetown, students at Georgetown have done a really remarkable job themselves investigating the history, researching the history, advocating around this history, and coming to a new understanding themselves about what the history means for themselves and for the university. So, we're here, Elsa, Lauret, and I are here, speaking about this history in this book. But for me, teaching this history at Georgetown, the students have been a constant inspiration and a driving force in making this history relevant to campus today.
We are getting a number of very intriguing questions. And although I think we all agree we could spend most of the evening exploring other aspects of this, I want to move toward those questions. Adam, maybe you could get us started on that. You have a fascinating document that you told me you'd be willing to kind of take apart for us and help us understand.
Yeah. 15 months of doing Zoom and I still forget to unmute myself. So this is actually it's a document that we include in the volume, and it's a document that I always use really on the first day of teaching about Georgetown's history with my students. And it's an advertisement that was placed in a DC newspaper called the National Intelligencer at the end of January 1814. And it's a runaway ad for a man named Isaac. And it says $30 reward. Ran away from Georgetown College on Saturday night, the 29th instant, a Negro man named Isaac, about 23 years old, quite black complexion, about 5 feet, 8 inches high. And it goes on to explain in some detail what he was wearing. It says, it is probable he may change his clothing. He has learned to read tolerably well, and it is likely he may have procured a written pass. It is supposed that he has gone to Pennsylvania. He was raised at Mrs. Johnson's near Bryantown, Charles County. And it goes on about the reward. To me, this is a very, one of the most striking documents that we have. It is proof of the presence of enslaved people on Georgetown's campus. He ran away from the college. We learned something about who he was, where he was born, the fact that he had learned to read. It's also evidence of his aspiration for freedom. And I think that can't be emphasized often enough. There's lots and lots of evidence in the Maryland Province archives and the Jesuit archives about their justifications for slavery. But there are very few documents written by or from the perspective of slaves themselves. So we don't really we don't really get what they had to say about this. So a runaway ad like this actually speaks volumes. It tells us about their aspirations for freedom. The Slavery Archive is also a freedom archive. It's an archive of all of the different ways that enslaved people connected to the Jesuits in Georgetown tried to get free. And that, I think, is one of the most important stories embedded in the archive. But the runaway ad itself also shows the lengths that the Jesuits and slave owners would go to secure their human property. And in fact, the end of the story is kind of a sad one. We know from John McElroy's journal, which he kept, that Isaac was actually arrested in Baltimore, thrown in jail, and sold as punishment. So just a very short document like this opens up many, many different dimensions on the history that we can learn from.
With that, let's look at what some of the rest of us are asking here. We were talking a moment ago about the rationale. How is it that these men of God, as it were, these soldiers of God, were so deeply involved in this business? And we have a couple of suggestions here. We have a suggestion, the Jesuits were in the mainstream of Christianity in practicing slavery. It goes back to Paul, who wrote, quote, "Slaves, obey your masters." And there is an additional comment here pointing out that this was also big business for the Jesuit order. Can you comment on the economics of this? What was, just briefly, what was the bottom line here? Was this a moneymaker? And how do we measure that?
Well, in the case of the plantations, we have a document in our edited collection that is written by a Jesuit brother called Joseph Moberly, in which he calculates that actually the Jesuit plantations were not a moneymaker for the Jesuits, that their practice of enslavement, especially when they were only planting labor-intensive crops such as tobacco and corn, was not as profitable as they would have liked. So actually, in the case of the Jesuits of Maryland, I would say that they were very crummy businessmen. They were, I mean, I know I shouldn't say these things in public because I always get in trouble, but if we look at the bottom line, I've looked at the financial records, they were seriously indebted. Their plantations were not profitable. The only assets, the only assets that they had were actually the people that they enslaved, which is why when they needed money, what they did was sell people. This is evident across time. You see it on financial records. They become indebted. How they pay that debt? By selling a person. That became like their financial way of operating. So in the bottom line, they weren't good. They did not have the financial acumen that one would expect, or how we imagine the Jesuit order operated. If we talk about other places all across the world, they were very rich because of enslaving, especially in Brazil and in New Spain. That's why they were suppressed. But in the case of Maryland, they were not as rich as one would imagine, which explains why they were so dependent on selling people to finance their operations.
So in a way, the mystery deepens with what you say, Elsa, that this was not profitable for them, and yet they did not rush to end the practice. And you also emphasize the importance of enslaved people as, in effect, capital. A follow-up economic question to one of you. How about compensated emancipation in 1862 in the district? Did the Jesuit order make claims under that act? Do we know?
No, there is no member of the Jesuit order nor Georgetown College. They did not make a claim in Compensated Emancipation Act of the District of Columbia. However, we do know that faculty members from Georgetown College submitted claims, members from the medical school, or people associated with the university, people that were benefactors of the school. They did submit claims, but the university itself and the Jesuits did not submit any claim in after the Compensated Emancipation Act.
Adam, a follow-up question just in concerning Isaac. Did Isaac run away in January of 1814? And if he January, February of 1814, and if so, was he trying to make contact with British forces who were had, of course, liberated African-American people during the Revolutionary War and who were again in the area?
That's an interesting question. Yes, he ran away in late January 1814 and was captured very quickly in Baltimore. Unfortunately, we don't have Isaac's perspective. We don't know why he was running or where he was going, or if he was going to the British or not. We only have the speculation in the ad itself that he was going to Pennsylvania to get free, basically. We do know, we have some other evidence from St. Inigo's, although I think this is from the Revolution, I may be getting this confused, that the British actually went ashore at St. Inigo's and took property from the Jesuits, and that the Jesuits were actually assisted and protected by one of the enslaved men who helped to manage St. Inigo's, Matthias Mahoney. So there are these stories that circulate about the Jesuits, the slaves, and the British, but they're by and large, they're not about the slaves fleeing to the British.
An interesting angle. We have a couple of questions from community historians and activists who are working with local cemeteries. Lisa Fager says, I oversee the oldest Black cemeteries, Mount Zion Female Union Band Society cemeteries in Washington, D.C. and in Georgetown at 27th and Q Streets. Has anyone at Georgetown tried to connect the dots and reunite families that lived, enslaved or free, outside the Georgetown University, but in Georgetown proper? Any takers on that one?
First of all, hi, Lisa. Great to get your question. And really, I applaud the work that you're doing on Zion and the Female Union Band Cemetery. It's really a very important work.
Could I jump in? Can you hear me at this point? Just to say that I would like to meet you, Lisa, because one of my ancestors is buried at Mount Zion Union Female Seminary. And she married, she is the queen. She is my most recent descendant, Mary Martha Queen. And I would very much like to speak with you. So perhaps we could get in contact after this.
We have a similar question here from Mary Belcher, who I know is active over at the cemeteries underneath our current Walter Pierce Park in the Adams Morgan neighborhood. And Mary Belcher says, have all the people listed on the Jesuit inventories as people to be sold been found on the manifests of outgoing ships?
So one point is that Elsa has worked through a lot of the material about the Holy Trinity burial ground that was on Georgetown's campus, and has uncovered a lot of names and families of people who were enslaved both at the college and beyond the college in the neighborhood of Georgetown. So that's the beginning of that process of identifying people and connecting the dots. So I'll just say that. Elsa, go, you can take it from there.
In the case of the people that have been identified in manifest, not everyone that was named in the census of people to be sold in 1838 was actually then shipped to Louisiana. So there have been people that have not been found. In the case of Georgetown and us as historians, we have not been doing genealogical work. The Georgetown Memory Project has really been focused in trying to identify people that remained in Maryland, which is sometimes a story that is not really like it's not really brought to light. A lot of people that are listed in this manifest remained in Maryland, and slavery continued in the Jesuit plantations after 1838, which is also a history that we try to emphasize in our book. But in the case of us, we believe that the genealogical work should be left to the experts, which are the genealogists. We try to do our best in trying to connect the dots and cooperate and bring out information, especially through the Georgetown Slavery Archive, but ourselves have not been directly involved in identifying people.
Adam, it looks like Belle's having a little trouble with her sound. Would you mind jumping into the Q&A and posing a few questions to your other panelists?
Sure, yes. Let's see what we have here. Don't I think, Adam, that the true shock of discovery was to descendants who did not know their own history, that the real failure was in not addressing the enslaved families before 2016? That's an interesting question, and maybe Lauret can speak to the revelation of how that felt to somebody who's descended from the people who were owned and sold. But I think that there's a lot of layers to this question of the broader knowledge of this history. Why is a history that's not hidden, that's sitting there in the archives, in scholarship, why is it that those stories are not better known? And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, some of them involving the divide between academia and, you know, the public. But a lot of it is just about, I think, a will to knowledge, a desire to know. You know, the first person to make the connection between a family that exists today and the GU 272 sold in 1838, that connection was made by a woman named Patricia Bayonne Johnson, who's a descendant of Mason Bibby Butler. And she was just looking, she's actually a genealogist herself, but 15 years ago, she went looking for her family history. She came across documents that our predecessors at Georgetown had put online through the Jesuit Plantation Project, including the manifest of the Catherine Jackson that carried some of the GU 272 to Louisiana. And with the help of a Louisiana genealogist named Judy Riffle, she figured out, you know, where her ancestors came from. She had a will to know. She found the tools and the information that was available to her, and her work, her desire to know her family history was actually the seed out of which the Georgetown Memory Project and the broader knowledge of the living descendants of the GU 272 came from. So I would just put an emphasis on the desire to know this history. And that can come from a lot of different places.
It's interesting. I think I can be heard again now. It's interesting how much the desire to know and curiosity has figured in the conversation tonight. Laura Haygood is back with us. So let's wrap with the final question here, which is, we have left an awful lot of ground uncovered. Lauret, starting with you and then moving to Elsa and then Adam, what are your final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with?
Just, I guess, a couple of thoughts. And Adam and Elsa noted this earlier, and it's concerning the violence of the archive in the sense that archival materials give stark but very fragmentary evidence, and they're also not given on the terms or in the voices of those who are being considered. The documents were made and sanctioned by people who brutalized those, or by those who supported brutality in the form of slavery. And so because they're not on the terms of those enslaved or on terms that those enslaved would choose, they're also not on the terms of how they saw themselves. And so recognizing this violence and realizing that we're seeing a very compressed and distorted view is very important, especially not only to researchers, but to those who are trying to understand their familial past. And the last thing is that it's essential to confront painful elements of this history, the legacy of slavery, and of the racism that it fed and still feeds and reinforced. And this legacy is malignant. So those are the two things I would consider. And just to note, I'm not a descendant of those who were sold in 1838. I'm a descendant of those who were enslaved and a descendant of those who found freedom through petition. So there are descendants who had relationships with slavery under the Jesuits in different ways.
Elsa?
First, I would like to say that I envision our book, and I invite you when you read it to think about it this way as an exercise in accountability. When I was doing research and I was like, deep down in the archives, I was struck by how is it that we decide who gets remembered and who does not. Adam mentioned that I prepared a list of people that were enslaved on campus and were enslaved in nearby Georgetown University and that are buried underneath one of Georgetown's buildings. If you visit Georgetown's campus, you will find a cemetery that is well preserved on campus. Manicured lawn, and the tombstones are white. It's full of Jesuit priests. But the cemetery where the people that were enslaved in the community of Georgetown, not just the campus, lies underneath the science building. So I believe that one of the uses of this history is not only accountability, but repair, to try and change who gets remembered. It shouldn't be, in the case of Georgetown, that just the Jesuit priests with their long history gets remembered. The people that were enslaved on campus and that were enslaved in the Jesuit plantations should also be remembered because they are part of Georgetown's history. So if you see the cover of our book, you will see that there are the names of the people that were sold in 1838 on the shape of one of the most distinctive buildings on campus, which is Healy Hall. So I believe that this was a brilliant move by the creative minds behind our cover, because it reflects one of the motivations of our book, which is to incorporate those who have been missing for too long into the history of the campus, and to emphasize how important this history is for the foundation of Georgetown, and also how we should grapple and continue to grapple with it, because it's a tragic history that, as Lauret says, has consequences to this day. So thank you.
Adam?
I just want to encourage everybody to dive deeply into the history in all of its tragedy and complexity. We live in a moment where history is very politicized, and a lot of people are afraid of taking an honest look at our past with all the tragedy in it. But I think we've found at Georgetown over the last 5 years, I've certainly found in conversations with my students that it is ultimately an enriching process to know the truth and the full truth about what has happened. And it can help us see the world today with new eyes. And I think that's valuable.
Well, panel, I think we can fairly say that you have whetted appetites. Laura?
Yeah, I have to say, I think we only just barely scratched the surface of this story and its complexity tonight. And so maybe there's a part 2 somewhere in the offing, and that there will be other opportunities at the DC History Center to explore this important legacy. So with that note, I really want to thank the speakers and Bell for joining us this evening. This program will be up on YouTube along with closed captioning in just a few days. So please feel free to share this link with your family, friends, family and colleagues. You'll also find other of our virtual programs on YouTube on that DC History channel. And there's really a wealth of wonderful resources there available for you. If you didn't purchase a copy of Facing Georgetown's History with your registration tonight, please do consider ordering one from our shop. The proceeds from those sales do benefit us as a small nonprofit organization. And you will also soon see a survey from us. We're eager to hear your thoughts on this program, what you learned from it. And we also would love to hear what other topics you would like to see in future programs. And so that feedback is just a wealth of great input for us. I would also like to acknowledge and express my thanks to those of you who donated to the DC History Center when you registered for tonight's program, because revenue from Zoom programs like this and from book sales are really a key source of support for us as a small nonprofit organization in the pandemic era. We're emerging, but we're not there yet. So if you enjoyed this program, please do consider going to dchistory.org and making a contribution. I further want to gratefully recognize Events DC and the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities for their general operating support of our organization. And thank you again. Adam Rothman, Elsa Mendoza, Lauret Savoy, Bell Julian Clement for leading really a spectacular conversation and an important one. And behind the scenes, I am grateful for the work of program managers Marin Orchard and Maggie Downing, as well as Ann McDonough, Katrina Ingraham, Tamora Wright, and Jane F. Levy. After tonight, we will be saying a sad goodbye to both Tamora and Maggie, who've been with us for most of the past year. And I just personally thank both of them for their tremendous contributions to our organization and this programming during this long year of pandemic. And they will both be very missed. So with those words of thanks, have a good evening.